be let in.
Okay,
No,
thank you.
I did just get in. Thank you,
Oh,
Esther.
okay, great.
Good.
Okay, thank you everyone for your patience and welcome to the presentation about the 2023 waste composition study. We're excited to share the results of this big project with you all. And we have MSW, John Culbertson from MSW Consultants here today to run the show. And MSW Consultants did the project, as you will learn, and our team has been supporting and consulting and asking questions. And I'm sure you all have good questions to ask also. So now I will mute and turn it over to you, John.
All right, wonderful. So it is the nature of, at least for me, presenting the PowerPoint via Teams that I can't actually see the Teams dashboard. I can see my preview slide, and hopefully everybody can see the full screen slide on the screen share okay. So Emma, I would encourage you to either shout or maybe even call my direct office phone if something happens, because I won't know it. So I apologize
okay,
about that.
Sounds great. Yeah,
Super.
I'll unmute if something comes up.
That'd be great. Yeah, and if I freeze in a really ridiculous position with my facial expression, everybody has signed the waiver that they won't screenshot that, right? That won't get out in the public. So I'm just going to keep right on going. So well, great. There is a lot of material to cover. This is obviously a body of work that so MSW Consultants does a lot of this type of work. We're in kind of an unprecedented time in terms of this sort of measurement work in our industry, with just an unbelievable amount of funding from various EPR needs assessments and Swiffer grants. It has been I think, a really solid, good learning process working with DEC in Vermont on this study update. So I'm going to try to go through what I think are just a whole host of very interesting pieces of information. I'm going to try to highlight some things that hopefully other folks find interesting. My guess is there could be a lot of questions. I understand we have an hour and a half. God forbid you have to listen to me for all of that. So I'm hoping to get through this maybe in about an hour. But I also would invite Emma or Josh or anybody else to call out if things are feeling like they're lagging, because I do probably have about 60 slides. So there's a fair amount of stuff to cover. So first and foremost, I start with the obligatory statement provided by our funding partner, the US EPA. And so I'm not going to read this because it's just going to slow us down. But the same statement, Josh, incidentally, has been added to the inside cover of the report. So I think we're covered now in terms of letting everybody know EPA's involvement. And the other thing is, before going forward, these studies take a lot of assistance from third parties that are devoting their time and their expertise and their attention, providing data and information. And we would be remiss at MSW Consultants if we didn't give a shout out to the various facility owners and operators, as well as, frankly, members of the business community. As you'll see on the next slide, this is the Vermont statewide waste characterization study update. But in addition to field data collection elements, as you can see on this slide, where we really got to do some pretty in-depth analysis of material streams going to landfill in Vermont, including the MSW stream, construction, demolition, and bulky waste stream, and for the first time, residuals coming out of the back end of MRFs in Vermont. But this study included some supplemental research on some targeted waste generators and other stakeholders in the Vermont ecosystem for materials management that we've used to supplement some of our understanding of just the pure field work. So with that, I'm going to start going through. So I showed the cover of the report. I believe the report has been publicly posted. I think we've had one or two little tiny adjustments, and I would invite DEC to correct me if I'm misstating, but the purpose of doing these studies is to get this data out in front of people who know the industry and know the data and know the users. And hopefully everything's looking good, but I've been doing this long enough to know occasionally there's some details that, may be a little squirrely. So it's having folks like you, in addition to MSW Consultants and our consultant team, as well as DEC, looking at this data frankly, what makes these reports better is getting feedback from knowledgeable individuals in the industry. So, hopefully there won't be any major issues, but appreciate the chance to share this and would welcome everybody's critical eye on what's being stated. With that, the slides that I'm going to go through roughly follow not roughly, closely follow the organization of the report. And so in some ways it feels a little out of order to me, but I'm just going to go ahead and go through it. So first, an executive summary. And by the way, Emma, is everything sounding okay? Looking okay? Volume's okay?
Yeah. I'm finding one person who's not muted, so I'm just muting them right now. All set. Thank you.
Super. All right. So so the report does start out with an executive summary, and candidly, this was a situation where there are so many factoids, data sets, findings, observations that it really is probably not possible to do justice to them in a short executive summary. So there was definitely some balancing going on in terms of what is in the executive summary. That said, the slides therefore follow the order of the report, and you'll see several times I'll remind folks that you can always dig deeper if you so desire. So as the name suggests, Vermont statewide waste characterization study. This actually, so we're going to highlight here at the outset the composition of municipal solid waste, which is a combination of residential and commercially generated, kind of household business putrescible type waste. So this is a combined statewide total. And honestly, this graph is, I think, something you'll find a similar pie chart in almost every study of this nature that's out there. And so what's interesting to me is DEC has dug into these categories and added some additional pie pieces to really give a good view of some of the maybe lesser known or less cited materials that make up significant components of the waste stream. And by the end of this presentation, you'll know more than you ever wanted to know. So, so another thing in the executive summary, it's important to note that the state of Vermont, this is its third iteration in doing this body of research. Although some of the elements of research have changed from prior studies, the main component of MSW and even C&D characterization have been done previously. And so throughout the report, in addition to showing the results from the current study, we've shown comparisons so that folks kind of at a glance can see what has changed or maybe not changed too much. And we at MSW Consultants think that that's really helpful, frankly, just from just assessing the reasonableness of the results. There are, we think, pretty well established methodologies. So getting consistent results with consistent methodologies, we think, is a good sign. So I am going to run through. I'm not going to read key findings. I'll leave you to look at them because I think we're going to touch on many, if not all, of these key findings. But these are some of the things that the team, the consultant team and DEC collectively identified as being of interest. And it really goes across the whole study. And really, these are kind of intended to be the highlights. These are the things that people are probably going to debate. I have some sense that time permits, maybe we'll come back here to the beginning of the slide deck at the conclusion of going through everything and maybe revisit some of these when you've gotten the background. I fear that if I go through these key findings now in detail, it's getting a little bit ahead of how we got there, but I did want to put some of these up for folks to contemplate. That said, DEC, if you think it would be appropriate to dive in a little bit at this point, I'm happy to do that. It just feels like coming back to this at the end will be maybe a cleaner way to get to it, if that's okay.
Yeah,
so,
that sounds good. To come
super.
Back to it.
Super. So, all right. So I think probably many of you, if you're in the state, you're familiar with prior work. If we have other folks, other stakeholders, my guess is most of the folks on this call are pretty familiar with the background. So I'm going to go through pretty quickly some of the methodology and foundational data. So first comment I'll make is for this study, we have applied our analysis to calendar year 2022 reported data, reported tonnage. So in Vermont, when C&D loads are delivered to facilities and are reported as C&D, they do get offset. But frankly, a lot of C&D is just in with MSW, municipal solid waste, so it's kind of mixed in. But you can see about 485,000 tons statewide were generated. This table is as reported. This excludes some tons that have been exported out of state, but we have focused on we've included the in-state tons because we think that's what our results apply to, whether they're disposed in-state or out of state. So, given that 465,000 tons of MSW can contain C&D, and also given that we want to know something about the breakdown between residentially generated and commercial, or ICI, which is industrial, commercial, institutional, an acronym for essentially non-residential waste. We conducted gate surveys at a subset of Vermont's disposal facilities and used those gate survey results to break down that 465,000. And so this table is just indicating to everybody that we needed some basis to separate the C&D from the mixed MSW, and we also needed some basis to separately analyze residentially generated and non-residentially generated waste. And so you can see about 87,000 tons of what was reported as MSW, we believe are more appropriately coded as a C&D bulky waste. So I think that's, for those of you that like state reports, hopefully those numbers are going to match up. We're big believers in trying to have our reports match up to officially published data. So a couple more methodology things. I'm going to flip through we're doing a lot of field data collection. We're doing a statistical representative sampling of different waste material streams. So that means we're traveling around the state to different facilities, different seasons. And so I've just got a series of tables that share the host facilities that we went to. And we felt very happy that we were able to generally achieve our sample targets. So for MSW hand sorts over a couple of seasons at multiple facilities. Same thing for C&D visuals. We went to 3 different facilities and we're able to essentially meet our targets for C&D visual samples. We'll come back to, again, some of the details on these. And a new, and I think pretty fascinating, and how shall I say this, engaging new component as we talk through these findings with DEC. This study for the first time incorporated sampling of the residue materials that are coming from MRFs that have done everything they can to pull out recyclable material and have to deal with either contaminants that shouldn't be there, and maybe there's some process loss, but we'll come back to that as well. But as this table hints at, it is not exactly trivial to go estimate MRF residues, because residues are generated at MRFs in multiple different places, and no 2 MRFs are the same in terms of how they are generating residues. So we'll again come back to this, but just want to share a little bit of our planning. I'll again show a map. I think we got we were happy with our geographic distribution. I think we hit the population centers. Obviously, DEC has a good handle on this and essentially directed us in terms of some good facilities to go to. And then the last thing I'll say just about the sort of overall methodology, I think everybody probably on this call is familiar with rolling up our results into material groups, so paper, plastic, metal, glass, as shown on the left. We have started making an attempt to recast material composition results in terms of divertibility, recyclability. There probably are a couple terms, maybe we even have made up divertibility, but all of the results throughout this report, in addition to being interpreted based on the material group, we have tried to assign these divertibility classes. And so I did want to point out that this could be, I think some of them are pretty straightforward, right? Mandated recyclable. I think there's not a whole lot of controversy with that, or mandated organic, because that comes straight from Vermont's system and state regs. But we've introduced this notion of potentially divertible materials in MSW, and also then things that just aren't divertible in Vermont at the moment. And these definitions, I think, are important. And I just want to call out that we're not claiming that MSW Consultants or even DEC has exactly the right spin on this classification system, but we're honestly trying to view these material streams through a lens of what is reasonable, to over time truly begin to get away from landfill. So there may be some questions on this, and I just want to call out that hey, this is an ongoing discussion, and this type of research hopefully will improve over time. So having just addressed divertibility, because we have MRF residues in the mix, I also want to point out to everybody on the phone that our definitions of potentially divertible and non-divertible change when we're talking about MRF residues. Things that in theory could be divertible getting disposed in landfill, for example, black plastic polypropylene may not be very divertible potentially. Bulky plastic, single resin bulky plastics, not mandated, could be divertible at a MRF, but then some of the things that might be divertible, elsewhere in the state, if you could pull it out of the waste stream, as soon as those items hit your MRF, you just can't, they become just not something you want in your recycling stream. So there's maybe a little bit of difference, and I'll show you as we go on. Readers of the report will be able to see exactly which materials we've classified into all of these divertibility categories. So C&D, no changes. And the last comment I'll make is, historically, I mean, these studies have been done for years and years. It's probably more widespread now, but we feel like we've really been able to build data management and QA/QC into, essentially field-based tablets that actually start doing some math and applying some analysis and giving our enumerators and our field teams real-time feedback on the data they're collecting. And so we just think that this system makes for better data. And there is one component of this update that may have been impacted a little bit. So, but we think this is really the way these studies go. I'll preview a joke I intend to use multiple times in the next year or two, but this is an example of our AI, which is actual intelligence as opposed to artificial intelligence, because we can't compete with artificial intelligence. So anyway, with that background, I've got some slides that we're essentially going to go through the key study areas of the job. And first and foremost on that is the composition of municipal solid waste in Vermont. So I've got some obligatory pictures, I think, of all of our field work, but this is a process where over the course of multiple days at different host facilities, we are taking essentially intermittent stratified samples of inbound residential and non-residential waste. We are getting assistance from the facility providers to take mechanical grab samples so that we're not using a human to determine where we're going to, what we're going to sort. And whatever comes to us gets sorted. So it's all very, very kind of, I won't say automated, because it's certainly being directed by a field supervisor, but we're letting the tipping truck and the grabbing bucket loader select the samples for us. So we feel very good about the representativeness of our samples. So at the outset, I showed actually a more detailed slide of MSW composition. So this pie chart actually reverts to what I would say, or I would argue, is a more customary breakdown by material group. So you can see paper, plastic, metal, glass, and some other some sort of special categories over on the left. And for those of you that are in the industry, we think we're continuing to see, paper's kind of going down, plastic's kind of going up, and then organics, depending on how you define it, that's probably the least consistency. If you look at many of these studies, different studies define organics differently. But these start to tell a little bit of a tale, and throughout the report, we've compared this update with the last update. So again, there probably is more data than anybody would ever want to dig into. So I'm going to try to hit some highlights. First is just some top 10 constituents. I think probably not surprising is we continue to see, even in light of Vermont banning food waste disposal in landfills, we continue to see food is it's a heavy, dense, wet form of waste. And we do continue to see that, in the landfill waste stream, although there certainly are some wins out there. But you can see if you go down through these top 10, I think what's interesting is we didn't see any of the kind of traditional mandated recyclables as the most prevalent remaining constituents. We're seeing a lot of hard to deal with materials in the top 10, which I think, speaks a lot to the focus on recycling in Vermont. I can't say that this is a top 10 list that we see across the board. I think there are other parts of the country that do have some more recyclable items sneak into the top 10. So I think this is, really kind of, in some regards, kind of a pat on the back, I think. So next, I'd like to now recast the MSW composition from this lens of divertibility. And so apologies to we do have some monochromatic graphs in here. I think we have been running around enough. We maybe didn't quite get it highlighted the way we wanted, but what's interesting is, you can see that in waste going to landfill, there still are some mandated recyclables. There still are some mandated food waste and yard waste organics. But really, I think on the low end compared to other studies we see, then we've got this potentially divertible pie, which has things like maybe some bulky plastics, maybe some scrap metals, things that could be legitimately diverted to third-party outlets, but maybe are not in curbside programs, for example. But I think it's really important that for all the effort and attention that we as an industry are paying on keeping waste out of landfills, there's quite a large number. The largest pie piece speaks to constituents that are not currently divertible in Vermont's recycling and diversion and composting and everything else ecosystem. So I just think this is, kind of a good sanity check for, we've come a long way, but certainly have a lot of forward progress we can still make. So next slide, I'm not expecting anybody to read or comprehend anything on this table, but I do want to point out that throughout the report, all of these graphs and charts and insights candidly come from these very dense statistical results tables. And so the report contains a great many of these tables, because it's really these numbers and these data that probably the planners and the stakeholders on this call are going to be really interested in, because we've applied our composition results to the various reported tonnages that are out there. And so it really gives a good picture, both from a percentage and an absolute generation standpoint. I do want to, some of you, if you're paying close attention, it looks like you can see it okay. You'll see the color-coded numbers of all the categories. So those color-coded numbers provide a clear roadmap to how we recast the results by material group into the different divertibility categories, which are in the legend at the bottom of the table. So throughout the report, those of you that really want to get into the weeds, we were trying to eliminate confusion in terms of how we took our results and showed them first by group and then by divertibility. And so we want to make that a transparent process. Folks may debate with us whether we categorize the divertibility correctly, but then you can make your own adjustments if you think we've miscategorized. And we're supportive of that as well. This is supposed to be usable data for Vermont's sustainable materials management community. So another kind of interesting Vermont twist on this work is that in addition to sorting the typical beverage containers into plastic and glass and cartons and metal, we also at DEC's behest and consistent with prior studies took each of those subsets of bottles and cans and did a subsort to differentiate between how many of these disposed containers were actually, should in theory have been returned from the bottle bill. Then there's another subset that is it's on the table. Vermont's been working for a long time. I probably don't know enough details, so I need to be a little careful in how I summarize it, but there's potential for an expanded bottle bill. So we differentiated those containers that would likely, be shifted to a bottle bill if it were to expand. And then there are still certain classes of bottles and cans that just are not expected to be in a bottle bill, or maybe they contain food, maybe they contain, a non-food, non-beverage product. And so we also have non-bottle bill containers. And I think this pie chart shows that across all the different types of bottles and cans, fairly even, call it a third, a third, a third. It's a little bit off. But it is interesting for those of you that have extra time and want to dive into the detailed summary table. You can see that it's a very different breakdown of the bottle bill, expanded bottle bill, non-bottle bill split, depending on which constituent you look at. And so we wanted to give all this data just so folks can contemplate what this means for their programs and for bottle bill systems. And so concluding the MSW composition findings. Again, I'd love to drone on as long as you let me, but that's probably not feasible to get to the end of some of the highlights. So please do check the report. We always try to provide comparisons between residentially generated and non-residentially generated. And we also have included a number of comparative graphics showing the 2023 study results next to the 2018 study results. And again, I think the idea is we've tried to both give visual and then ideally some tabular data for those of you that really want to be able to dig in. So, plant that seed there. And I guess the flip side is, look at the report if you suffer from insomnia. So I'm going to take a breath, but I'm going to keep rolling because there's a lot to cover. So construction and demolition is the second stream that Vermont has previously investigated in terms of composition. And so we have repeated our review of bulky C&D materials and bulky waste. And what's interesting about C&D debris is that the methodology to characterize it is different because as you can see from these photos, sorting a 200-pound sample, you may get, one big piece of furniture and a pallet, and there's your 200 pounds, and that's not very representative. So we'll look at this a little bit later, but our methodology for determining the composition of construction and demolition involves detailed volumetric measurements of the inbound container and the fullness of that container. And then it involves an algorithm of visual volumetric surveying, which historically has been done on paper forms, and then it comes back to the office and gets entered into a spreadsheet and the math gets worked through. And we are very happy that, the technology exists today to actually put those density conversion calculations on our field tablets in the hands of our enumerators. So that as they're measuring container dimensions and they're estimating the fullness and they're walking around estimating the percent by volume of the materials, they're seeing those volumetric estimates be converted with density factors into the actual weights in real time. And then they have the ability to go to the scale house and confirm the actual weight at the scale house so that they can calibrate their visual estimates against the actual weight. And so we feel like, it's a little hard to measure, but we feel like we've got demonstrably more accurate estimates when you have that level of calculational ability in the field doing this type of work. So I think that's a big plus. So, all right, my first pie chart, it stubbornly clings to showing you the C&D composition by the same groups, right? Paper, plastic, metal, glass. Well, obviously C&D is huge, so that's not that informative. So with a little bit of input from DEC and just a little bit of looking at the data, we also provide a recast composition of construction and demolition debris that breaks down some of the major components that we found at our host facilities. And so, again, all of these pie charts go back to some underlying line items that you can mix and match and group however you want. But we did want to, kind of make this a little more usable in this format. So we also applied our divertibility lens to C&D debris. And again, we tried to be, Vermont specific. And we obviously took as much input and help as we could get, from DEC and just identifying constituents that do have outlets in Vermont, maybe not throughout the whole state. It could be that there's some places that don't. But you can see, thankfully, not a whole lot of mandated recyclables or organics, as one would expect in construction and demolition debris. And, pretty high divertibility. This study, I think it's important to note, this study did not assess how reasonable it is for the generators of construction, demolition, renovation waste, bulky waste to effectively source separate these potentially divertible materials and to economically collect them and transport them economically to processors or end markets. So I think it's important. We're not here saying, oh, you should snap your fingers and be diverting all this. We're just commenting that there is processing capacity and ability to recover if those materials could be effectively and economically separated and delivered to the appropriate location. So I think that's an important limitation when we report things, the divertibility of waste. So same comment with C&D. I would refer everybody to our report where we've tried to show the detailed line items of our composition estimates, as well as applying those to the C&D tons that we found, and also showing how we have mapped each of those constituents into the different divertibility classes. And we would invite folks to reclassify those and carve up our classifications, as needed based on your region, your location. This data is really supposed to be highly usable for those of you who care to take the time and want to do so. And finally, I might have a backwards slide here. Some additional data, some comparisons of C&D. I think I have a following slide that I'm supposed to take out. But again, we continue to provide comparisons of composition and divertibility. And I mentioned the divertibility factors. And yeah, I think we forgot to delete this little extra. This is a bonus slide, everybody. How about that? So here's a comparison of the top 10 of C&D debris of the last two studies. This is, I guess, now that this is still in here, it's possible that so over time, I mentioned that we have real-time density conversion calculations on our tablets. We continue to adjust that data over time because we do a lot of these studies. And so it is possible that some of the difference between 2018 and 2023 could come from just better attuned conversion factors and us just really calibrating and trying to optimize our ability to calculate. But generally speaking, things fall pretty much in line. But I did want to call out that in the C&D world, the estimation tools, in our opinion, are getting better and more effective. And I think that's going to continue to percolate through the field. Another deep breath for those of you, and for those of you who are still with us. So what does all this composition data mean? Well, the first two chapters, the first two sections are just purely reporting on what we found in terms of composition and then applying that composition to tons. But one of the fascinating and interesting things about this project is, along with the supplemental research, which I'll get to, this is going to be a little bit out of order, but we are able to apply some additional critical thinking on these data sets and to infer some additional, I think, really certainly interesting results, certainly results worth discussing and debating and carving up and supporting and not supporting and all that kind of stuff. And so we actually added a chapter to this report where we got to do a little bit of additional insight into what this data means. So the first additional piece of data is, unlike prior years, we decided to go ahead and combine MSW composition with C&D composition. And so this is a chapter of the report that at the end of the day, the mix going into landfills is the combination of all of that material. And so we've just taken the liberty then to combine all of that together. So those of you that want to compare the solid waste stream with MSW individually or C&D individually now have the ability to do that. So that was kind of the first sort of analytical add-on. So second component, and I believe this has been done previously, but we, having characterized and identified mandated recyclables that are being disposed at landfill, and then working with DEC to obtain the reported mandated recyclables recovered in Vermont, we were able to build essentially a recycling recovery rate. So on the left, this left-hand column, it's a little bit small, but on the left-hand column, you'll see our estimates of the mean composition and the mean tonnage of targeted recyclables going to landfill. And in the middle column entitled recycling, we have pulled reported recycling tonnages. And when we combine all of these, we can't do it row by row because of the reporting differences from the waste comp categories. And we actually tried that. We couldn't make that work because of some crossover and some things that just weren't quite consistent. But what's really interesting from our standpoint is this math suggests there's about over a 70% recovery rate on these mandated recyclables. So recovery rates are, they've been around a long time, but they're starting to be more widely measured. And our sense is that that's quite quite an impressive recovery rate for typical mandated recyclables, especially over a statewide waste shed. We probably do more of this work, on the residential stream for individual cities and counties that have really, really good records of the tonnage, the residential MSW tonnage and the residential single stream tonnage. And we quite frequently see lower numbers than that 71%. So certainly the methodology to arrive at this number is different at the state level than it would be at a municipal level. But I still think it's really an informative exercise. And I think our sense is it does speak to Vermont having, really an ethic of diverting materials from landfill and recovering materials. So, and again, these are things that probably some of you will debate over time going forward, but a good number. I can already tell you that we flubbed updating the title of this slide. So ignore, if you would, the title of the slide and instead look at, so the next sort of additional analytical steps we could take involve the same recovery rate drill down on food scraps. And so this is actually table 4.3 from our report, which should have been turned into the slide title, but we wanted to and frankly, there's an inordinate amount of detail in the report as to how we arrived at these numbers through a combination of direct surveying and some estimation from residential behavior surveys of how they do residential scrap. And I'll get into these a little bit later. But at this point, wanted to pull forward some estimates of food scrap generation in our basis. And you can see some of our numbers, we have a little bit of a range. Some of them, we just have a single number. So there are a lot of moving parts. It's candidly probably not possible to put perfect statistical margins of error or confidence intervals on this, but we're trying to acknowledge that some of these numbers are like direct survey results. Some of these are statistical estimates, and we're trying to put them together in logical fashion to just try to get a feel for what things are looking like in Vermont in terms of food scrap recovery rates. Again, a little bit of a sketchy formatted table. But this is, I think, better laid out in the report. And what this table shows is, let's see, did we just go back and forth? Yeah, we did. I think we just put the same table in. Okay, that's what happened. We put the same table in twice. I got it now. Josh, Emma, I probably owe you guys a drink for messing that up. In any case, food scrap recovery rate. So we have come back with what we think the data are saying. And so in Vermont, that is one of the foremost, most progressive states out there that are trying to keep food out of landfill. And so when you combine, all these different sources or different ways, pathways for food waste, from backyard composting to, on-farm solutions to actual commercial facilities, so on and so forth. We're estimating, 50 to 57%, 51, 57%. That feels, to be candid, and I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, DEC, that feels high. But then again, Vermont has, I think, demonstrated through all the data we collect that it's really in the ethic. So, I think there probably are some communities in some parts of the country that would love to get a 50% recovery rate for curbside recyclables. So the fact that Vermont is seeing this, which I'm sure is driven by the large commercial generators of food scraps and food waste, I think those are a real focus. But it just shows, I think, some real potential for diverting organics from the landfill stream. And again, more data, more background, and how we got this. In fact, we'll come to some of this a little bit later. So let me jump on to a new component of this year's research. Everybody knows we're sending single stream and drop off and various commercial recyclables to MRFs. And I think everybody at this point has seen all the news about how negative contamination is in the recycling stream, all forms of contamination. But in theory, if our recycling facilities are, making use of technology upgrades and optimizing their systems, and frankly, if we recycling generators and Vermont's recyclers are helping by keeping contamination low, you like to see as much of those recyclables be recovered as possible. And so for this study, DEC was interested in looking at the residues, so what's coming out the back of MRFs and going to landfill, and just trying to get kind of a first-time profile of that material. And so, so as part of the study, we were able to spend time, and I'm going to go into some more detail, but just going through MRFs. And frankly, these are all facilities are all a little bit different. We received excellent support from Casella, who was operating these facilities, which was critical to making this come off, because this is a little bit innovative in terms of trying to do this research and really hit all the details. And so I want to show you this table. I apologize if it's a little bit small, and I don't know what happened. We will clean up these borders. Emma, before we send this out to everybody. I actually don't know what happened to the borders on these tables, so forgive me for that. But what I want to call folks' attention to is there's no such thing. No MRF just has, oh, here's our residue, and then you go sort it, you know what's in it. Probably everybody or most people on this call know MRFs well enough to know that there are many ejection points at a typical MRF where unwanted materials are pulled off of the stream, the infeed, and then as the hopefully remaining recyclables progress through all the sorting stations and filters and optimal sorters and robotic arms and AI systems and whatever else are in place, they're pulling all of the targeted mandated recyclables, but invariably you get some process loss. And so this table, I think, conveys the complexity of recycling at a modern MRF, because we found 7 different ejection points combined as you look at the MRFs that we went to, where those MRFs are making efforts to get contaminants, unwanted material out of the stream, and then they invariably have some things coming kind of out the back of the process. And so we wanted to look at all of that, and all of that is collectively residue. So I just think that's a really important point, that we just don't want to oversimplify what residue is at a MRF. And I think we were able to, with the cooperation of the facility owners and operators, we were able to, I think, accommodate and capture the impact of some of that complexity, because we actually had to, and I think I've got a table coming up. Actually, maybe I don't, but we actually had to, at each of the host facilities, we had to work very closely with the facility operators to estimate the contribution to total residue from all of these ejection points. So underneath this table and underneath our results is really a great deal of detailed review of information and debate and collaboration, quite frankly, so that we are as accurately as possible estimating residues as a whole. And so in our report, in addition to what I'm going to show you next, we have provided some insight on the composition of these different ejection points. So those of you that are into MRFs may want to dig in more detail, but I do want to just hit some high-level results, which I think are really interesting. So first of all, based strictly on reported tonnage, Vermont's MRFs have a remarkably low reported residue rate. So, I mean, less than 10% residue rate. Again, candidly, we do enough work around the country that we see those residue rates, I mean, frankly, get alarmingly high into the 20s and even 30, in the 30s. And God forbid if it's getting much higher than that. But Vermont, right off the bat, the data suggests is doing a great job getting clean materials in the front door of its MRFs. So when we go and work up the composition of all these different ejection point residues, weight them and build them back up, this pie chart shows what we found. And again, these are stated in terms of the divertibility categories. And you can see from that big red Pac-Man pie piece that shows my age, that 3/4 of MRF residue is in fact residue. It's contaminants that really the Vermont's MRFs would love to never have 75% of that stuff come in the front door. And what's also interesting is now on the far other end at the mandated recyclables, we found very little. We found very, very low incidence of plastic, glass, metal, containers, bottles and cans. Now, certainly plastics include, so the potentially divertible, we get into single resin bulky plastics. Some MRFs will try to pull out a number 5 polypropylene container, but their systems can't handle black polypropylene or other black plastics. So that potentially divertible is kind of an aspirational thing, but just not operationally practical at the current time potentially. And maybe not also the same at every MRF in Vermont or elsewhere. So again, folks may debate how we've classified this, but we've provided the underlying data so that you may modify how you group together these results to suit your particular location and have conversations, with your particular recycler. And, I've been using residuals. Maybe I should have put this picture a little further up. But residuals really are, it's two things. It's contaminants, which you really don't want. So that picture on the left is a sample of pre-sort contamination. MRFs, as they are loading their recyclables up an in-feed conveyor and taking a first look at them, they're trying to get big, bulky plastic, non-recyclable stuff out of the recycling right up front, get it out of the way. And so that left-hand photograph is a pre-sort material sample. The photograph on the right is a sample of end-of-line residues that are coming, kind of out the back after all the optical sorting, after all the manual sorting. What you can see in this photo are all the things coming out the back. And what's interesting to me is, I can see, I think we can see, various pieces of paper and some plastic, but, not a whole lot of clear bottles and cans. Maybe there's one or two in there. But in some regards, I think these are really good examples of what MRF residue would be expected to look like, albeit it could be very different in different facilities. And again, these are just 2 of the ejection points. So I think we had 7 or 8 overall, including some, glass rejection, which I don't have a picture of. So, all right. So same comment. Again, we've made some statements in the report, and we've grouped some results in ways that made sense as MSW consultants and DEC work through the numbers. But we want to make sure, you have the line item data and you can recast these results based on how your MRF might be operating and maybe based on your knowledge of recycling. And so we are big fans of having this data be accessible in that regard. And I think, I guess if I can maybe call out qualitatively some of what this means is because, I think it was demonstrated that we're persuaded, there's a lot of unfortunate talk about, recycling is fake. I think those of us in the industry know darn well how critical and how, how developed of an industry it is. But nonetheless, I think this study highlighted, some of the challenges to processing mixed recyclables. If you're going to recover the good recyclables, just getting the bad recyclables out of the way that's a challenge. Bagged materials are a challenge. I think there probably are some really well-meaning recyclers who, they need to carry their recycling from their house out to the curb or out to the drop-off center or whatever. They put them in plastic bags. Well, MRFs can't stop and open all the plastic bags. So we categorize plastic bags as a contaminant. And then some other things, just there's a certain degradation. If you imagine running, a piece of cardboard, compacting it on a truck and then dumping it out, loading it with a bucket loader and running it over a conveyor belt, it starts to rip, it starts to tear. Things might break, things might get, crushed up really, really small. So material degradation actually contributes to the residue. And in fact, a lot of the residues we found were a sub 2-inch minus particle size. We just don't have the equipment, and no manual sorter is going to go recycle things that are less than 2 inches in diameter. So I think this study really has some categories that highlight the legitimate challenges that we face operationally to maximize recycling recovery. But again, I have only quibbles because I actually think Vermont's MRFs are doing a really good job based on the data we collected. A couple other graphs, and then we'll get done with this. So in most prevalent MRF residue categories, again, a big thumbs up. If you quickly scan down these categories on this top 10 list, none of them are mandated recyclables, right? That's what you would expect. But hey, it's good to see real data from time to time that, residues, that's what this stuff is. Our study found that MRF residues, they really shouldn't have been there to begin with. There maybe is some plastic maybe some black plastic that in theory could be recovered, that is probably showing up here in some of these categories. But in terms of what we're designing our systems and dealing with the most prevalent packaging, products and packaging, Vermont's MRFs are doing a good job. So putting this into some statewide tonnage numbers, just recapping, this is pretty interesting. So again, we estimated almost, a little over 69,000 tons of recyclables were reported to have been generated in Vermont. And it was reported that about almost 10% of those were reported as to be residue, right? So, 69,000 down to 6.6 thousand. So, based on our analysis of residue applied to that 6659 number on the second row of the table, if you just isolate the mandated recyclables, we only found less than 1%, 0.7% of that residue were mandated recyclables. And out of that, only 0.4%, 0.4% of that residue were bottles, jars, and cans. So those bottom two rows, that's your process loss, right? That's kind of your yield loss. And while we're not experts in all manufacturing industries, we do believe that's a concept that anybody in industrial processing is dealing with some process loss or some yield loss, and that's really what we found here. And again, I believe we've got this mapped out so folks can go and corroborate this and talk about it and recast it as you see fit. And so I think with that, in terms of MRF residue composition, again, you'll find more tables. You'll find, and this is really interesting. Arguably, I should have put a slide in, but you'll find that you can compare the composition of the different injection points. So I've got one last slide for our MRF residue section. As we were ramping up the project, there was, I think, some stakeholders and DEC expressed an interest. Could we possibly add some sorts of recovered tubs and lids? And again, many thanks to the host MRFs on this study, but we were able to we were actually able to intercept sorted tubs and lids after sortation, but prior to baling. So that was great because it's hard to tear apart bales and get an accurate sort. But we were able to get 8 samples of tubs and lids for each of the 2 facilities that hosted this work. And so I would characterize this as a kind of a supplemental piece of data. We're not telling you that this is representative. We kind of fit this in as best we could. And so in some regards, it's new data where no data existed. But I think we weren't terribly surprised to see that these tubs and lid bales are predominantly polypropylene, which we know there's a real drive in recycling right now to increase diversion of number 5 resins. And then HDPE, not far behind in terms of the overall mix of tubs and lid, bales, so to speak. So hopefully that is of interest to a few folks. All right. Hey, the good news is I'm closing in. I'm down well below 10 slides because I think I'm coming in on the hour. So I'm going to go through. So in addition to the field work, which as you probably could tell is near and dear to our heart as a firm and just a space that I've spent a lot of my career in, I find this to be fascinating. Vermont has not just stopped at field data collection of composition, but I think DEC has done a thoughtful job at identifying research that enhances our ability to make sense of the pure field data collection and material composition. And so I'm going to go probably too rapidly through the supplemental research that we've done. So I'll make a statement. I think the supplemental research where we're surveying, it's a little tougher. It's a little fuzzier. We're asking and trying to compile information that maybe not every respondent is really measuring with perfect accuracy, right? We're trying to take a good faith effort to learn supplemental information and do our best interpreting the data we get back. So we had 3 supplemental research initiatives as part of this work. And the first was an update of research into residential food scrap management behaviors. And as this slide suggests, we actually engaged the University of New Hampshire Survey Center, which in some regards, I think everybody's familiar with a survey. And historically, those used to be, pick a random sample of folks and call them. Well, I think it's, at this point, folks know that modern mobile communications pretty much render the legacy survey practices to be not very efficient, very expensive, and arguably not of the greatest accuracy. Especially if you look at various polls of election outcomes. But we used our teaming partner, the Survey Center of University of New Hampshire, used a really interesting and what we really found to be a compelling approach to do this research, where over time they essentially build representative panels of volunteers from their target locations, and they use their standing representative panels as a basis for surveying, as opposed to hoping they randomly get people to respond to phone calls. And I thought that was really great. We got almost 1,000 responses, 33% from this panel, which was reported to give a margin of error plus or minus 3.2%. And so we actually did make a comment that this appears to be really a compelling methodology for those of you that might be considering, these broad-based surveys. So again, kudos to our partners on that. So when looking at the data, so essentially these are residential households that provided feedback. And this is just a table. I won't go through all of the results, but what I would point out is that, we tried to get a breakdown of how residential households are what are their methods of diverting. And then we've tried to apply some capture rates. And I do need to call out, we also had as a teaming partner, DSM Environmental Services. DSM managed this project, and particularly this task, both on the 2018 study and on this study. And my sense and understanding is that we've essentially been pretty consistent in how we've applied our assumptions to each of the studies. So again, I'm of the opinion that well-meaning folks can debate whether these are the right assumptions. But we're trying to be as transparent as we can, so that if folks think we've over or underestimated something in terms of like capture rate from different residential diversion methods, you've got the ability to go back and play around and revise and come up with your estimates. So, but this is interesting because, we're coming up that, almost 40,000 tons of residentially generated food scraps are getting diverted through many different options, ranging from backyard composting to in-sink disposal to feeding to their farm animals to whatever it is. And so, again, this is all written up in more detail. But what this leaves us with, and again, forgive the table, but we essentially were able to go. So from this survey, we reported almost 40,000 tons diverted. And then we could go to our MSW composition study and find the tons that were disposed. And so this is really an interesting source of kind of where food scraps seem to be going from the residential sector. And it also, we tried to estimate like a per capita number in terms of how much food is out there, which we were able to compare with some other communities, which I don't have the tables here in the presentation. But again, more detail for those of you that care to dig into the report. In some regards, I would imagine we'll get questions, but again, trying to just be forthright in our thinking and how we arrived at these numbers. So the next component, or the next supplemental research, we looked at direct to broker recycling. So not all recyclables are collected by a hauler and delivered to a mixed recycling processing facility. We know that larger generators, some national chains, folks that generate a lot of certain items, they're already aggregating or maybe baling and maybe backhauling or selling directly to a market or to a broker. So those are tons that aren't getting reported by the recycling facilities in Vermont. So consistent with the prior study, we had essentially direct outreach to a whole list of entities that potentially would be backhauling or economically recycling material. So the good news is there was comparability. I would say maybe the not as great news is we found the response rates to be materially lower, even with a lot of the same respondents as last time. I'd love to tell you we didn't get terrible responses, but we didn't get as much response as we'd like. And so that left us having to apply some additional, just sort of additional thinking about, were the responses we got reasonable? And I can see we did not increase the font on this table, but hopefully you can see that looks okay on the screen. But we tried to compare the direct responses, the reported responses in 2023. And then we went back to the entities. We actually had the benefit of having the 2018 list of survey recipients and responses. So we were able to go and kind of extrapolate what the 2023 response rate would have been had those entities actually responded. I'll be the first. I'm not looking anybody in the eye and telling you, hey, hang your hat on these numbers. But I think what we're trying to say is we've tried to maintain consistency and we've tried to imply at least reasonable logic to see where we think we compare with the prior study. And in some regards, we think that essentially we're down, paper and packaging down a little bit from the prior study. But a takeaway is it's getting harder, we think, to do this sort of direct outreach and questionnaire, surveying to businesses that aren't in our industry, just for a lot of reasons. So, all right, final piece of information here: organics transporter research. I'm not going to have the exact start date, but Vermont's full ban on food scraps going to landfill has kicked in. And the state now permits transporters of organics. So obviously, a lot of organics that are being collected are going to organics processing facilities, but it was speculated or known by DEC that some of those organics go elsewhere. And so what we tried to do was, contact as many transporters as we could. We got about half of the transporters, but we do believe we got the very largest transporters in the state. And we're able to, identify, there's some food going out of state, and then there's some sort of non-standard outlets that we were able to find. And again, there's a great deal of background on all of the supplemental research. I will tell you, it feels a little fuzzier probably to the reader, and even to us that did the work and collaborated with DEC. But I think we've put good attention on all of it, and we would welcome your thoughts and feedback as you go through it. And I really think. Final report, again, tons of details, a lot of stuff to go through. I'm 5 minutes over my target. So I'm going to take a pause because I'm on my last slide. And from here, I would welcome Emma to determine, should we go to questions? Should we jump back up and look at key findings? But thank you all for your attention. Those of you anyway who are still awake, definitely appreciate it. And we frankly thought this was a really cool project. And so thanks for the opportunity to go through some of the key findings.
Thanks so much, John. Yeah, I think we should go through the key findings. It can be brief also, and then we'll do our round of applause there and switch over to questions. Thanks so much. Key findings will help refresh people on what their questions were on the different parts of the project. And also, thank you so much.
Super. Let me go ahead and get that queued back up. So, yeah.
And John,
oh, yes.
While you're getting that queued back up, let me just say this: Josh Kelly, Solid Waste Program Manager, DEC. I really want to thank MSW Consultants and DSM Environmental and UNH Survey Center for their work. This, as you can see, if you've stayed on this long, is a huge body of work, and MSW Consultants went through a lot of back and forth with us. A great collaborator, and just again a huge body of work that I don't know if we've ever had this level of a thorough waste composition study done. This is probably the highest level one we've ever done. So thank you. Let me just put that out there from us.
Well, super. I am ready to share and go to, let's not hit the leave button, share button. So we'll go back to key findings, and this is probably a good way to finish up real quick. Again, the key findings, I think to Josh's point about collaboration, we knew we need to put an executive summary together. Come on, go to, there we go. Is that back, by the way? It looks like it's back.
Yes, you're good.
Super. Yeah, I think we got to the point where MSW looked at DEC and said, hey, DEC, can you help us prioritize what you want to put in key findings? Because we could have put about a 10-page executive summary together. So these key findings,
just real quickly, I think reflects some highlights. By no means is this comprehensive. And I think, I guess really, I mean, we do this work, we're data people, if you haven't noticed, but we do this work to put information in the public realm that can, be relied upon and used to think about how to do things differently and better in our industry. So anyway, I will run through these now real quick. Population in Vermont, we found that had grown according to sources, but the disposal, the material going to landfill, was down. So hey, that just at the top level, I mean, that's a plus. So the second bullet about lower disposal of food scraps, again, at the risk of getting into the data details, these reports, both the Vermont report and other data you may see, could report both on a percentage basis, but also by applying the percentages to the actual tons, you can get a different perspective on things. And so we always encourage the folks that go do the drill down into this work to look at both, because sometimes the percentages tell a slightly different story than the tons. And so on food scraps, that is the case. And on a percentage basis, if you were to compare the last study with this study, the percentages might not, they don't look very different. Like, oh, gee, we have a food waste ban and it hasn't changed. Well, when you actually look at the overall tonnage generation and apply the results to each study, we do see meaningful decrease in food scraps, which I think is, intuitively, we're happy to see that, because that's what you would expect would happen. So it's nice to have that kind of bear out in the data. So I mentioned, we've advanced this food waste recovery rate for the first time in light of all the data. I have to be honest, and with the risk of Emma and Josh, getting concerned, I think as this sort of methodology gets performed again, whether it's a future iteration in Vermont, whether it's other states or communities, I think we'll see how that number holds up. I mean, just to be candid with everybody, but I think we took a really good shot at arriving at numbers that we can defend. Mandated recyclables continue to go down. Really high recovery rate for mandated recyclables. So again, these are all real positives. Reported MRF residue rates. Don't see sub 10% residue at MRFs in a lot of parts of the country. So again, those are just things that I think are highlighted. And then maybe drilling down a little bit into things. First attempt at MRF residue composition, and just really again kind of being able to put real data on what you would intuitively expect to be in MRF residue. It was mostly contamination materials that a MRF isn't ever targeting to recover. And a very small number of mandated recyclables. So I think that is important to be able to look at. Beverage containers. Well, I mean, if you have a bottle bill, beverage containers are a big deal from a policy standpoint. Not seeing a whole lot disposed as MSW. And you know what, the waste comp geek in me has to point out, any waste composition number you look at is probably slightly overstated the lighter the material. So if you look at plastic bottles in the MSW stream that have been, maybe thrown away because nobody scraped the peanut butter out of the jar, maybe they've been compacted and have a bunch of grit that's sort of crushed into them. So these are all, I would argue, on the high end. Probably the real number of containers in MSW to landfill is probably a little lower than that if you were to be able to magically adjust for the impact of contamination. So I think that's important to remember. But again, we were able to see, do a little deep dive into the, bottle bill, non-bottle bill. Certainly we did find some bottle bill containers still going into the landfill stream, but the majority of them by far were not bottle bill containers that were getting disposed to landfill. So I think that speaks to some, effectiveness of that program. Plastics, continue to increase. This is not a Vermont specific finding. I think we've seen this pretty routinely. Although my comment that plastics are probably overstated, I think that applies to plastics. Plastics include expanded polystyrene and various films, primarily polyethylene, but some other films. Those are very contaminated. Frankly, there's not a whole lot of data, but anytime you see a plastic number in any waste composition study, that number is probably a little on the high side. And we can debate. Somebody wants to talk offline about how to adjust for that or what that might entail. Maybe we could think about that. But textiles, I think this is interesting. I don't know about everybody on the phone, but I think the fashion industry in the last year or two, has finally kind of taken the hint. I feel like I've seen a lot of articles in the trade publications talking about fashion industry initiatives to reduce textile disposal from fast fashion. And so we're definitely seeing that impact in the disposed waste stream. And, again, kind of high level, C&D debris probably gets short shrift because most of that debris is generated and managed outside of the domain of local governments. But that remains, a significant part of the state's waste stream, but with significant opportunities for diversion. So those are my two key finding slides. And now I truly am done talking at everybody.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, well, round of applause for John, and thank you for that. Yeah, whirlwind tour of a big project. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so folks are welcome to raise a hand and unmute to ask, or you're also welcome to drop questions in the chat.
I could open the chat.
Okay, we've got one question from John Fay. Thanks for getting us started, John. Everyone else thanks a little bit. Let's see. John asks, why do you think the decrease in disposed food scraps is so minor? Yeah,
So,
oh, yeah, you go ahead.
Well, I guess to me, we could debate minor a little bit. I mean, I think on a tonnage basis, we felt like that there was, some meaningful reduction on a tonnage basis. That said, I mean, this is my spin. I would welcome Emma to comment as well. Our basis for calculating some of that is there's some professional judgment. There's some, giving it our best shot. So I think, that may be some of it. Although, John, are you asking about like dispose, like going to landfill from the MSW results?
Right. Yep.
So you know what? So I don't have the ability to load this quickly, but we do have some bar charts that compare the last study and this study. And on many of our comparative bar charts, we actually have put, essentially a margin of error, a confidence interval, little bracket around the mean. So I think one comment I have is this entire presentation and almost all the data anybody on this call sees about waste characterization is people reporting on the mean estimate of the statistical analysis. It is in fact more accurate to report on the margin of error or the confidence intervals, which if we tried to do that consistently, we'd about triple the size of the report. So I do think that maybe digging down a little bit and looking at those margins of error, it could be bigger or frankly smaller than what our mean averages show. So I apologize. I'm probably not ready to really answer that in more detail just because I don't quite have the numbers in my mind on this call. But again, I assume DEC will keep track, and if there's anything that comes out that we need to dig into, we will.
And Jen asks a great follow-up question, John. I don't know if you have more thoughts. Jen asks, can you talk about any statistical deviation we can expect in the waste composition data, given the volume of samples collected and the total volume of MSW generated?
Yeah, so the statistics of waste composition are very interesting, and frankly are based on a 30-plus-year-old standard that gets kind of rolled out and cited probably more often than it's actually reviewed and understood. But the statistics of waste composition are predicated on the particle sizes of waste being small enough that if you get about a 200-pound grab, the particle sizes over many, many grabs are going to be representative of a very high tonnage of waste. So even the very biggest waste composition studies that you might see in New York City or California that may get thousands of samples, the weight of those samples are fractions of a % of the total waste generated. But what the statistics are going for is kind of how consistent is the composition of each constituent from sample to sample. So the sampling targets in this study and in really all studies are trying to get above a threshold where, one outlier, really oddball sample isn't going to torpedo the outcome. if you think about it, if we took, 5 samples of residential waste and one of the samples was somebody just, threw out their old ripped couch, that wouldn't be very representative when we ran the numbers on those 5 samples. But if we take 100 samples of residential waste and one of them is an old ripped up couch, then the impact of that really oddball outlier sample is minimized. So I don't know if this is exactly answering your question, but I do think that Vermont and most of these larger studies, they reach the point where the statistics become stable, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Jen, feel free to unmute if you need a follow-up question for that. Let's do one more question from Jen in the chat, and then we'll go to the hand up in the DEC office. Jen asks, what effort was made to avoid having the flood debris from last summer impact the waste composition numbers?
So really the answer to that was just an awareness that could possibly, we could see some of that material. So every single sample we obtained was preceded by an interview of the inbound driver and a visual observation of the contents of the load. So just knowing that the state had come through that period, we believe that we were effective at not intermixing, kind of the non-standard flood debris.
Thank you. Yes, over to, is it Josh or Ann? Want to unmute?
It's Barb.
Oh, hi,
Barb.
Barb Schwinn. A couple short questions, I hope. So for household hazardous waste, we've been trying to keep that out of the landfills, but it looked like in your report, I think you listed that as not divertible. And I would think that should be in the divertible since we've been trying to get people to divert it, even though it's not recyclable, to divert it from landfilling.
So, Barb, if I got your name correct, that is exactly the type of insight that does not surprise me, that kind of how different stakeholders view, so I couldn't agree more. Keeping HHW out of landfill, very important. The fact that we maybe classified it in a different way, I think that just kind of supports our we can see that maybe some of our classifications don't capture the nuance of what should be happening with a material like that. I'll share, we're not HHW specialists at MSW, but I'll share that we absolutely, know that in many localities and clients, we're trying to keep that material out of the landfill. Some HHW maybe is reusable or even somehow recoverable, but a lot of it just needs to go to special disposal. So even though it's not in the local landfill, it could end up as a disposal item. So those are, really good points and very accurate in terms of how HHW really functions. And it just was beyond our ability to probably classify that fairly in our report. But your understanding is exactly right. And, if you think maybe that's miscategorized, we want to make sure you have the data in this report to make your adjustments and be able to tell the story properly from your perspective about HHW.
Thanks. And I was also curious, what trucks did you just say, no, we're not interested in that truck? No can do.
Yeah, so we avoided any imported material. I candidly don't know. I don't know. We might know, but probably not. We avoided non-Vermont material entirely. Because we were for MSW, we were trying to differentiate between residentially generated and non-residentially generated. There are parts of Vermont where some of the smaller haulers are just running their routes and they're throwing a couple of houses in the truck, and then they go do a little row of businesses and then a couple of houses, then a little businesses. And so we also asked the delivering drivers and visually screened the loads. If we had very mixed residential and non-residential loads, we also would omit those because we wouldn't know how to we couldn't separate out the residential component from the the non-residential component materials. But I don't think we don't believe that was a huge fraction, but those would have been 2 reasons that we would not have taken systematically or randomly selected load.
Thanks.
We have time probably for 1 to 3 more questions.
I think I've bludgeoned everybody into silence. So
Well, while folks are thinking, if they have a last question, I can just say that we will be updating the PDF on our website to include the EPA's disclaimer language. So the link that you have will always work and just be the most current version, and it'll just replace it. So I would just suggest you use the website link instead of downloading a version, and then you might not have the most current version.
yeah, cool.
All right. Okay, well, if there's no final questions, I'll say thank you so much to John and your whole team at MSW and DSM and University of New Hampshire, and to all the folks in this room who also operate facilities or answered questions or helped in some other ways. It was a true group effort.
It was.
And I'll be sharing this recording out. So if you have a colleague who wanted to attend but was not able to, I'll be circulating that recording, or they can reach out to me directly at emma.stool@vermont.gov.
Super. And for those of you who are interested in the next 2 years, if you're interested in waste characterization, keep your eyes on New Hampshire, Maine, Maryland, South Carolina, Georgia, Nebraska, Nevada, Hawaii, Tennessee. It's mind-boggling how much of this work is going to be coming up in the next couple of years. So there we should suddenly be deluged with comparative data sets. So keep your eyes open. Anyway, thanks very much, Emma and Josh, and all the DEC folks that really had to dig into a tremendous amount of data. Couldn't have done it without your input. So appreciate the chance to present to the group.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right,
Super.
thanks.
All
Bye,
right.
everyone.
Bye, everybody.